So in this video, we're going to take a look at the pituitary gland. And remember, the first goal that anytime we look at a microscope, the first goal is just to determine what are we looking at, what organ are we looking at, what tissue are we looking at, and then, and only then, can we start to talk about what are the parts and pieces, and what do those parts and pieces do if that's important for what we're looking at in the microscope. So let's take a look. We're going to look at a number of different slides. Some of them are going to be kind of similar. Some of them will look a little different. But the goal is to figure out what is the consistent visual cues that we see from each slide. So let's get to look at it. Okay, so here is the first slide. Again, remember, the first goal we have anytime we walk up on a microscope is identifying what in the world are we looking at, and keeping in mind what it is that you are being asked to know. So for the endocrine system lab, we're only really asking you to identify structures of three places: the pituitary gland, the pancreas, and the thyroid gland. And so this is the pituitary gland, also referred to as the hypophysis, not hypothesis, the educated guess step of the scientific method, but a hypophysis, P-H-Y-S-I-S. And one of the things that I always talk about is, again, when you're studying these, look at the things that are visually distinct from each other. So what are the things that you can look at here and you can say, okay, this is just looks different from another part. And so we can see very quickly that we have this kind of area over here. It's a little lighter in this purple color here. And then we have this darker area right here. Now, I can't show the entire pituitary gland on the slide because they're pretty big, even in a mouse, which is, I think this is where this comes from. But we can see, okay, there are two visually distinct large regions, and there's this one over here. Now, I think that happens to be a blood vessel, but we're really just focusing on these two. Now, within them, we can see, now we're not going to talk about this, but I just want to kind of validate this idea of seeing things that are visually distinct from each other. So if we look at this lighter area, we see kind of this light purple core, and then we see this outer layer here that's a little, I think it's darker purple, kind of a little more grainy. We're not worried about naming that, but I just want to just kind of reiterate the idea of those. That's what I mean by visually distinct regions. So let's back up and look at the two big ones here. Okay, so first of all, we see these two large, one's kind of smaller, one's very large. And that's typically, not always, but typically how this works out. So don't hang your hat on that. Because remember, what we're going to do is we're not depending on color, we're not depending on things that can change, we're depending on things that are consistent. So what are the things that are consistent, right? So first of all, we're going to have these two different stain texture, and we're talking visual texture here, areas. That's one of the first things you can go to and know that this is a pituitary gland. The next thing is, notice this darker area, and we'll be able to see this a little more when we get a little further into when we get more magnification. But this darker area looks a little grainy, whereas this area here looks a little more, I like to use the word wispy. Okay, that's because if we remember, well, first of all, let me identify this. This area here is the anterior pituitary gland. This area here is the posterior pituitary gland. Okay? Now, how can we know that? Well, remember from when we talked about the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, remember we said that the anterior pituitary is a true endocrine gland. The cells of the anterior pituitary make and secrete the hormones that come from that part of the pituitary. One of the things you should understand is that most, and I'm not a pathologist by any stretch of the imagination, but most glandular structures have a grainy appearance to them. And we're going to see that throughout all of the different types of tissues, well, the two other types of tissues that we're going to look at, the pancreas and the thyroid gland. The glands have a grainy appearance to them. And I'd like to think that I'm correct in saying in that is a fairly transcendent property of all glandular tissue. It has this grainy appearance. We'll look into as we zoom in. This is at 40x. As we zoom in, we'll kind of see a little bit more of that. So this is the anterior pituitary. This one over here is the posterior pituitary. Now remember, the posterior pituitary is really kind of an extension of the hypothalamus, which is a brain structure, which is mostly neural tissue. If you remember back from Biology 121 or A&P I, in those first few weeks when we're looking at the different tissue, if you remember, neural tissue or nervous tissue looked kind of wispy. And so this is the posterior pituitary gland because it's primarily neural tissue. And so it's going to have that wispy, not as grainy looking appearance. The other thing is the reason why this looks so grainy over here, the anterior pituitary, is we have a bunch of cells that are packed really tightly together. Over here, those cells are not packed as tightly together, so they don't give that dense, dark staining. Now, the darkness comes from the way this particular stain works, which I believe this is H&E, or it's also called hematoxylin and eosin. The reason why that anterior pituitary gland looks the way it does is because we have a lot of cells that are kind of, not super tiny, but, they're smaller cells, and they're packed tightly together. So imagine if you were making a drawing, right? And you were doing something that we refer to as ponchilism, which if you're familiar with art techniques, you probably might know the term ponchilism. If you don't, Google the painting. I think it's called Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte, and I think this is Jaat. I don't remember who painted it. But if you Google that, you probably recognize the picture. Well, that picture is made by just the painter just putting dots of paint. That's what's called ponchilism. So imagine now if you're trying to draw something, if you wanted to make an area appear darker, and again, remember, all you're doing is putting little dots. You're going to want to put those dots a little closer together. Another example, if you see etchings, like you probably remember from history books, especially when you're looking at very early history, when you're looking at these etchings and these prints, if the artist wants to make an area appear darker, they put the markings closer together. So where I'm trying to get at is the reason why this anterior pituitary looks darker is because the cells are essentially squeezed closer. They're not squeezed, but they're packed more tightly together. Here, there's a lot more space between the nuclei, and so it's going to appear a little less dense, therefore a little less, I want to say maybe it's going to appear a little lighter in color. In art, we would call that value, how dark or light a color is. And so those are the big giveaways. So again, the big giveaway that this is the anterior pituitary gland. We have a very distinct kind of a dark grainy region. And then we have a little less dark, a little lighter, more wispy of a region. That tells us, probably looking at the Pituitary gland. Now, again, this is in the context of the three tissues we're studying. I don't know if there are any other tissues that would kind of mimic this pattern, but as far as the three that we're studying, this is the go-to on how you know that you're looking at the pituitary. And then we need to differentiate between, well, which one is anterior pituitary, which one's posterior. The anterior pituitary is the one that is darker, more grainy. The cells are packed more tightly together. The posterior pituitary is going to be the one that is a little more wispy. It's going to be a lighter color, less dense than the anterior pituitary. So let's zoom in real quick. Let me get this adjusted. We're going to go to 100x. There it is. I'm going to try to get it on the... There we go. Let's see if my old man eyes can adjust. I'm going to move this to where we have that division between the two. A little more relevant. Okay. So now we're getting a better look at the cells. And again, see all these little purple dots? Those are the nuclei of the cells of the anterior pituitary gland. We've also got some, looks like maybe some blood vessels and that sort of thing, which, you know, we're not worried about for this class. But again, I just want to highlight the idea that, again, and for the posterior pituitary, we're mostly focused on this. We're not too worried about this. I'm not quite sure what this is. It's probably some sort of epithelial layer. I'm going to guess maybe stratified cuboidal, maybe. But we're really, you know, when we're talking about the difference between anterior and posterior pituitary, we're really looking at the big meaty part, the middle of the posterior pituitary gland. And here we've got some, you know, we can almost see maybe some epithelial tissue here, maybe some, I don't know if that would be simple or some stratified cuboidal, but again, we're looking mostly at the bulk of it. So again, notice the cells and the tissues are kind of wispy looking. The nuclei are not packed together because remember, these are primarily neurons. So neurons have a cell body and they have these projections, so it looks a little more wispy. Here the cells are packed a little more tightly together. So again, anterior pituitary here, posterior pituitary here. Let's just to complete it out, and I don't imagine we would see something like this on an exam or anything. Let's look at it under this. So that version we just looked at was 100x. This is 400x. I think it's just kind of neat to, you know, just see what's going on here. So here's that gap. This little edge right here is that what I think is an epithelial layer of the posterior. But yeah, so here it looks like we have some blood vessels. Those look like red blood cells. Let me see if I can get this a little closer. There we go. Let's make a little adjustment here. Again, I'm hoping my old man eyes are not deceiving myself. But yeah, notice again, here's all these cells that are packed tightly together. There's a nuclei. The cytoplasm kind of stains a little more dark. So again, this is not anything that I would ask you to, you know, repeat on an exam, but I just want to get in and show you this is how you can tell the difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary. So let's go over this little gap here and back into, this is the posterior pituitary gland. Let me get a little more in focus. Oh. And yep, almost, there we go. I think that's good. Yeah, so again, the nuclei are not so packed together. It looks a little more wispy. Now, I don't know what all this tissue is. I'm sure there are names for it, but we're just going to, again, focus on the fact that this is a little more wispy. The nuclei There we go. I think that's good. The nuclei are not, packed tightly together, so it looks a little more wispy. It looks a little more lighter in color because things aren't so densely packed together. Okay, so let's take another look at another slide. I'm going to see if I can find one that looks a little different but still shows the same thing. So I'm going to push pause and we'll come back in a moment. So if you want to take a minute to kind of think about this while I change slides, this would be a good place to go ahead and pause. Okay, so here is another slide. Again, what are we looking for? We're looking for when we first see a slide, we want to know what are we looking at the big picture? What tissue, what organ? And again, what is consistent? So if you go back, if you slide back to the beginning of this video, this kind of looks a little different from the original or from that first slide that I showed you. However, this is still pituitary gland. How do we know that? Because we've got this large area here that's kind of darker and grainy, and we have this area here, again, not as large, and I can't show the entire pituitary gland on the slide. I think, yeah, this one is from a human, so I don't even think this is the entire cross-section. But again, what do we see? We see this large, dark, grainy area, and this large, but maybe a little less prominent, lighter, wispier area. Okay, and we can see some other things. This little gap between the two regions isn't out as pronounced as it was before. It looks like these are some blood vessels. That looks like red blood cells in there. These are probably some blood vessels here. Not quite sure what that is. But again, we're not worried about that. I just want to, just kind of validate that, yeah, there are these other things in there. But what are the big picture items? This darker area here, this lighter, wispier area here. So let's zoom in on that. Let's go to 100x. We'll get focused in. See if we can get it right across. There we go. There we go. Now, again, this doesn't look like the slide we had before exactly, right? We can see some differences, but what is consistent? Here's, again, look at the lighter, less packed together over here, and this is the posterior pituitary. This area here, that's where the cells are more packed together. And remember, one of the things that you should try to work on is identifying what is a cell, so that you kind of know where one cell begins and one cell ends. Not that you're going to get asked that on an exam, but it's going to help answer these kinds of questions and help you identify things. These are not just a bunch of random, speckled dots. These are cells. So here they're packed tightly together. The cells are small, cuboid for the most part. Here, they're not cuboid. Again, this is the posterior pituitary. Those are primarily neural tissue or nervous tissue. Remember, go back and review what you learned in Biology 121 or A&P I. Nervous tissue looks kind of wispy and not very dense. And that's what we see here. So this is posterior pituitary. This is anterior pituitary gland. And again, just like we did last time, let's zoom in and really take a look at this. And again, this is not something that I would show you on an exam. I wouldn't show you just this view and expect for you to be able to tell me that, if this is all that you saw, you would be able to tell me that that's posterior pituitary gland. I don't think that's a fair question for this level of study. If we were budding pathologists, maybe that might be a fair question. I'm sure it would be. But this is anterior pituitary gland. Again, these little specks here, those are all individual cells. Those darker ones are the nuclei of individual cells. But we can see they're packed tightly together. That gives them the grainy appearance. That gives them that denser, darker look. And if we go over again, I think it was over this way. Yep, there we go. Again, we can see the wispiness. Again, cells not so packed tightly together. Therefore, that gives that a lighter, less dense look. It's a little more wispy than grainy, and this is a posterior pituitary gland. Okay, I'm going to switch slides. I want to get another one. We'll see if we can find one that looks different, but still, what are we looking for? We're looking for the things that are consistent. All right, so here is a third sample. Now this is not as distinct as we've seen in the previous two samples, but I hope that you can see, and just so you know, I'm speaking to students in my class. I wouldn't really feel comfortable showing you this and asking you questions, but I'm going to go ahead and show it just because I do want to point out what are the consistent things that we see. And so hopefully, I hope you can see this area over here is visually distinct from this area. Okay, now what I want you to do is I just want you to take some time. Let me see if I can get it. Kind of this space here is kind of the dividing line. We have this area over here and this area over here. And I want you to pause and try to guess, not guess, but use the things that we've learned in this video so far and figure out which is which one's the anterior pituitary and which one is the posterior pituitary. So take a moment if you need to put pause or push pause, do that, and push play when you are ready to hear my discussion. So if you press pause, fantastic. If not, if you're just kind of going along, that's fine too. What are the consistent things? What I hope you see is that this area over here, although they kind of look grainy, this is a little bit more grainy, and it is slightly darker and more compact than this area over here. Now, you may not necessarily be able to see that from this view, but if we come over here, let's go to, that was the 40x view. Let's come over to the, this is the 100x view. And now let's go back and forth. So again, here's our kind of dividing line. And I hope you can see it's a little more wispy, not as packed together. You know, we do have some of these big spaces. Again, I'm not quite sure what these big spaces are. This is a human pituitary gland, so I don't know if this is, I don't know, I can't imagine they're fatty deposits. Maybe they are, I don't know. But if we look at where the cells are, which like this area here, those cells are kind of packed together. Again, they're kind of cuboid shaped, and I'll show the 400x view just so we can kind of validate that. Here, things are more wispy. Now, the reason why this looks doesn't look as dark is because, again, we have these spaces in here that we didn't have in the previous previous samples that we looked at. Okay, so this is anterior pituitary, this is posterior pituitary. Now, just want to make sure we don't fall into this trap. So far, anterior pituitary has been on the right, posterior pituitary has been on the left. So I hope you're not looking at and saying, oh, well, I just need to remember anterior is on the right, posterior is on the left. Maybe, I don't know, but that's not necessarily always going to be a consistent thing. So the person that's making this slide, it may just be that the way they slice it and the way they cut it and mount it on the slide, it ends up being that the anterior ends up on this side and the posterior ends up on this side. So I'm going to look to see if I can find one more, maybe a couple more. I'm going to look to see if I can find another slide. Again, just want to kind of galvanize what are we looking at, and I'll be back. So give me just a second. Before I do that, sorry, I want to go and look at the 400x view. Again, this is not anything I would necessarily show on an exam, but I just want to look at it kind of for funsies. So this is going to be the, I think this is our kind of dividing line here. So here we're looking at the anterior pituitary gland side. Again, notice, again, all these are cells. The dark is the nucleus of the cell. This light area, that's the cytoplasm of that particular cell right there. Again, I don't know what all these spaces are, but again, cells, cuboid in shape. Remember, cuboid means about as tall as they are wide. And then if we go over to the left, we just grabbed the wrong one. Again, there seems like there are a few more cells here than in previous posterior pituitaries that we looked at in this video. But again, we see that wispiness. They're not as packed tightly together, just kind of whooshy, wispy. I'm not sure what those are. I don't know if that's fat deposits or whatever, but not a pathologist. But anyway, just want to show that before I get to the next slide. And I have one more slide, and then we'll end the video. All right, so here's the fourth and final slide of the pituitary gland that we're going to look at. Again, I'm glad I said something about, not falling into the trap of the anterior is on the right, posterior pituitary is on the left, because here we go. How do we know this is a pituitary gland? We have this large, dark, grainy area. Here we have a larger, or large, but maybe not as large. Again, I can't show the whole gland to compare size. It doesn't say if this is a human or not. Probably is. Seems pretty big, but either way, here we've got this large, dark, grainy area, this lighter, wispy area here. And so that's our ding, ding, ding that we're looking at a pituitary gland. And so now we've got well, before I do that, I want you to take a moment and I want you to figure out which is which. So what is this area? What is this area? Which one is anterior? Which one's posterior pituitary gland? So if you need to pause, push the pause button. I'll count to about 3 or 4 in my head, and then I'll continue. I'll take a little sip of my drink. Not a drink, but a drink. All right. So this is the anterior pituitary, and this area here is the posterior pituitary. Again, how do we know? This is the darker, grainy looking side. This is the lighter, more wispier, especially in this area here. It looks really wispy. Okay, so let's look at this. So that's the 40x view. This is the 100x view. Let me get it zoomed in. Get it centered. There's our little dividing line between the two. And again, there's that, what I think is an epithelial layer. Again, I don't know for sure, but let's compare, right? So here we're getting a little closer. The cells, and I'll show you the 400x view so you can know, yeah, these are cells packed tightly together, more dense, more nuclei. Putting those dots closer together is going to make it look darker and definitely grainy. Here, a little more wispy. And again, remember, we're looking at this part of the posterior pituitary gland, not this stuff. Again, I'm pretty convinced this is probably some sort of epithelial layer, but again, not 100% sure. So let's go ahead and look at the 400x view. Again, this is not anything I would test you over in my class, but I just want to kind of look at stuff because, I don't know, microscopy is fun. I like this stuff. I like looking at things. It's like, I don't know, it's like looking at artwork, It's a shame when I go to museums, people will spend very, very little time in front of a painting and they miss so much. Painting is the thing that I like to, that's my jam, is painting. They just miss so much, especially on these older paintings where you've got a lot of symbolism, a lot of characters, a lot of things of visual interest. But so again, we're on the anterior pituitary gland side. Again, we can see the cells, we can see the nuclei, we can see the actual borders of some of these cells. We can actually see, that there looks like there's some different cells. Now, I don't know, again, my anterior pituitary gland histology, I'm not at that level, but I can see, again, if we use those observational skills, this is staining that way for a reason. It could be an artifact, which an artifact is kind of like something that shows up that looks a little different, but it's not something, it doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of an accident. It could be that. I don't know, but I can definitely see these cells here are staining a little more. They're taking the stain up a little differently. Does that mean they might function differently? Heck, I don't know. But anyway, cells packed together, grainy, gives us that dark appearance. Let's go back to the other side. Again, now here, if we looked at the other ones, if you remember the other ones, the nuclei were kind of cigar-shaped, kind of stretched out. Here, they're a little more circular. Does that mean anything? I don't know. It could be the sharpness of the knife. Maybe as a knife cut. In those other images, here we can get a real good idea of the wispiness. We can see actual projections of the neurons. That's what all these little wispy looking things are. Here they're a little bit more elongated. But it could be that they were elongated, the nuclei were elongated in the previous slides just because maybe the knife was dull. And I forget what they call that knife. Not micrometer. I think it's micro something. Anyway, microtome. That's what it is. Maybe it was just dull and those cells got squished, Again, this is not a histology class, but I like to point out those differences. But that doesn't dictate how we interpret this, right? So that's it. That's the pituitary gland. So remember what we're looking for to differentiate that is the pituitary gland is we want to look for those two, again, not necessarily equal size, but definitely those two larger visually distinct areas. One is darker and grainy. One is a little lighter and wispier. For the classes I teach, more than likely I will be showing images on like a quiz or an exam. I'll be showing at the 40x or the 100x level at the very most, showing something at the 400x level, 40, 100, and then 400x. It just, you can't compare. And I need for you to be able to compare the two areas in order to show you that. But yeah, so the only reason why I showed the 400x is just, I don't know, because it's like looking at artwork. I like looking at that stuff and I like to share, things I like to look at and why I like microscopy so much and cell biology and all that stuff. Anyway, yeah, so hopefully that clears up pituitary gland. If not, certainly ask me some questions, send me an email. All right, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.